The air hung thick with a stifling humidity as Lucas trudged deeper into the swamp, each step sinking into the mud that clung to his boots with a stubborn grip. The mist wrapped around him like a damp shroud, swallowing sounds and muting colors until everything appeared in shades of gray. Only the distant silhouette of the inn loomed ahead, barely visible through the dense fog, appearing and disappearing with each drift of mist, as if teasing him to come closer. Lucas tightened his grip on his camera, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against his ears, the oppressive quiet only broken by the occasional splash of unseen creatures slipping beneath the murky water. As he approached, the inn's shape began to sharpen, revealing a structure that looked impossibly old, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The wooden boards were warped and stained, their surfaces slick with moss and strange dark stains that could have been the remnants of old rainwater, or something far more sinister. The windows were dark, their panes shattered or clouded over with a grime so thick it seemed like the building itself was rotting from the inside out. Lucas hesitated, feeling an inexplicable weight settle over his chest, a primal warning that urged him to turn back. But his curiosity and determination to capture a truly unique photo pushed him forward. Crossing the threshold, Lucas immediately felt a chill that ran deeper than the dampness of the swamp outside. The air inside was heavy, stale, and filled with a scent that he couldn't quite place, something between mold and decay, tinged with an iron-like sharpness. The walls seemed to close in around him, their warped wood panels pressing down as though they carried the weight of centuries of secrets. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness, each creak of the floorboards resonating like the groan of some unseen creature lurking just out of sight. He moved carefully down the narrow hallway, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, and every so often he would catch a glimpse of movement, a trick of the light, he told himself, though his heart pounded with growing unease. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, and a feeling began to gnaw at him, a certainty that he was not alone. But every time he turned, there was nothing behind him but the empty corridor, stretching back toward the entrance that now seemed infinitely far away. As he reached what looked like the main lobby, Lucas noticed something out of place on the dusty floorboards, a small, brightly colored object that stood in stark contrast to the gloom around him. Bending down, he picked it up and realized it was a toy, a spinning top, chipped and weathered with age, but still vibrant with reds and blues. A chill ran down his spine as a memory surfaced, foggy and half-forgotten. He had owned a toy exactly like this as a child. The realization struck him like a blow, and suddenly, the inn felt alive around him, its walls seeming to breathe, almost as though it recognized him. The silence was broken by a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft whisper, echoing from somewhere deep within the inn. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, mournful wail that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, filling the air with an invisible, inescapable dread. Lucas's skin prickled with goosebumps as he strained to listen, his pulse racing with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Against his better judgment, he took a step forward, drawn toward the sound that seemed to pulse and throb like a heartbeat, luring him deeper into the heart of the decaying inn. The mist outside thickened, pressing against the windows, and the entire building groaned as if shifting under an immense, invisible weight. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist on the walls, forming shapes that were almost human, yet distorted, like reflections in broken glass. Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a suffocating awareness that he had crossed into a place that did not belong to the living. Lucas clutched the small, weathered spinning top in his hand, its faded colors barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the dust-caked windows. As he turned it over, a memory began to stir, a long-buried fragment of his childhood, veiled in shadows he had long forgotten. He remembered being a young boy, wandering through a darkened forest on a family camping trip, separated from his parents for what felt like hours. In the darkness, he had stumbled upon an identical spinning top, lying on the ground as if waiting for him. That night had been swallowed by fear and confusion, an experience he had pushed into the deepest recesses of his mind. Now, standing in the oppressive silence of the inn, he realized that memory was resurfacing with disturbing clarity. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his left hand, pulling him from his thoughts. Looking down, he saw the faint outline of an old scar, a mark he had forgotten, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The scar had always been there, but he had never remembered how he got it, nor why it throbbed now with a cold, aching burn. The sensation grew as he held the spinning top, as if the wound were resonating with the inn, with something lurking within its walls. Shadows shifted along the hallway, and Lucas could almost sense them watching him, lingering just out of sight. A strange lullaby began to echo through the decaying structure, soft and haunting, as if carried by a breeze that shouldn't exist in the stagnant, suffocating air of the inn. The melody was eerily familiar, yet unsettling, like a forgotten song sung by a distant memory. It seemed to wrap around him, burrowing into his thoughts, pulling him further into the darkness. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the lullaby persisted, growing louder, its notes twisting into a melody that was both mournful and sinister. As he moved cautiously down the hallway, Lucas's mind began to fill with images from his childhood, flashes of places he hadn't thought of in years. He saw the house he grew up in, the backyard where he used to play, the face of his mother calling him in for dinner. But there was something wrong with these images. They felt tainted, as if some malevolent force had seeped into his memories, warping them into something grotesque. The faces of his loved ones appeared distorted, their eyes hollow, their smiles twisted into grimaces of despair. Desperately, he shook his head, but the images persisted, blending with the eerie surroundings of the inn. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, like they were alive, feeding off his memories. The lullaby grew louder, closer, and Lucas realized it was guiding him, luring him deeper into the inn, as if it knew something about him that even he had forgotten. The air grew colder, thick with an indescribable weight, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. In a trance-like state, Lucas found himself in a room he didn't remember entering. The walls were covered with faded, peeling wallpaper, and an ancient mirror stood in one corner, its glass cracked and dusty. He felt compelled to approach it, drawn by some invisible force. When he looked into the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but a young boy staring back at him, his younger self, clutching the spinning top with a look of sheer terror in his eyes. The boy's lips moved, forming silent words, but Lucas couldn't hear him. It was as if the glass were a barrier between two worlds, separating him from a version of himself trapped in some forgotten nightmare. As he reached out to touch the mirror, the boy in the reflection mirrored his movement, their fingers almost touching across the divide. Suddenly, a pair of ghostly hands appeared on the boy's shoulders, pale and skeletal, tightening their grip until the boy's face contorted in agony. Lucas staggered back, his heart pounding, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The boy's mouth opened in a silent scream, and Lucas could feel it reverberating through his own soul, a terror that transcended time, connecting them across the years in a shared, inexplicable horror. A voice, low and distorted, whispered from the shadows, chilling him to the bone. "You left a part of yourself here, Lucas. A part you can never reclaim." The room seemed to close in around him, and he felt the weight of a past he could barely remember pressing down on him, binding him to the inn in ways he couldn't comprehend. This place had known him, even before he'd set foot inside it, and had been waiting all this time, feeding on that forgotten fragment of his soul, a piece of him that had never truly left. Terrified, Lucas stumbled backward, clutching the spinning top tightly, as if it were a lifeline, yet knowing it was the very object chaining him to this nightmare. The lullaby faded into an ominous silence, leaving only the echo of his heartbeat as he realized the horrible truth. This inn, this decaying relic, was more than a building. It was a vessel of memories, a prison for the lost and forgotten, and he was now part of its twisted history. Lucas felt his knees grow weak as he stumbled out of the room, clutching the spinning top like a lifeline, even though he knew it was somehow connected to the nightmare unfolding around him. he could still feel the icy touch of those ghostly hands from the mirror, as if they had pressed into his own skin. The silence that followed was almost louder than the eerie lullaby that had haunted him moments before. It pressed against his ears, filling his mind with a weight that grew heavier with each step he took, each echo of his own ragged breathing reverberating down the endless corridors of the inn. Just as he thought he might have found his way back to the lobby, the floor seemed to shift beneath him, and he found himself standing at the edge of a dark, cavernous room he hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with strange symbols, scrawled in dark red, each one twisting and shifting as if alive. Shadows clung to every corner, darker and thicker than should be possible, seeming to pulse and breathe as if they had a life of their own. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate chair, draped in tattered velvet, and beside it a figure, a shadowy apparition, cloaked in darkness with a faint, otherworldly glow. The figure raised its head, and though Lucas couldn't make out its face, he felt its eyes boring into him, stripping away every layer of his being until he fell naked and vulnerable, laid bare before something infinitely older and more malevolent than he could comprehend. The figure's voice was a whisper that echoed inside his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. "You came here seeking something, did you not? But you must leave something behind if you wish to leave at all." A chill ran down his spine as he realized that this wasn't a mere haunting. This was a test, a cruel game set in place by forces beyond his understanding. The shadowy figure continued, its voice thick with a perverse satisfaction. "You must choose, Lucas. If you wish to escape, you must offer a piece of yourself." In that moment, images flooded his mind, memories of laughter, of love, of everything that had once given him purpose and joy. The voice offered him three options, each one more terrifying than the last. First, he could sacrifice his most precious memory, his mother's laugh, the warmth of her embrace, something that had sustained him through his darkest days. The thought twisted his heart, filling him with a deep, aching sorrow, knowing that part of him would vanish forever, leaving a void he could never fill. The second choice was darker, more twisted. The figure offered him a chance to absorb part of the darkness that lurked within the inn, binding it to his own soul in order to contain it. But he knew deep down that this would change him irrevocably, that carrying this malevolence would twist him, darken him in ways he could not even imagine. He felt his stomach churn at the thought, an instinctive revulsion that told him this path would corrupt everything he once held dear, that he would never look at himself in the mirror without seeing something monstrous staring back. The final choice chilled him to the core, a trade of his sanity for freedom. The figure offered him a way out, a promise that he would leave the inn, but warned that he would never again see the world as he once did. His mind would fracture, the line between reality and nightmare forever blurred. Every shadow, every whisper would haunt him, turning his life into a waking nightmare. He would escape, but he would never be free. Lucas's mind reeled as he weighed each option, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls shifting closer, the symbols bleeding into one another, each line and shape a mocking reminder of the price he had to pay. Panic clawed at his throat, and he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, his hands shaking as he clutched the spinning top like a talisman, though he knew it offered no protection here. "Choose," the figure whispered, the word laced with a cruel impatience. "Or remain here, another ghost bound to this place, forgotten by the world beyond." Desperation took hold, and Lucas found himself thinking about what he was willing to lose, what piece of himself he could afford to leave behind. He thought of his life outside the inn, of the friends and family he might never see again, of a world that would move on without him. A hollow emptiness grew in his chest as he considered the possibility of sacrificing his mother's memory, the thought that he might forget her laugh, the way she'd comforted him when he was scared as a child. That memory was a part of him, an anchor that kept him grounded, and he wasn't sure he could bear to lose it. But the other choices loomed darkly, filling his mind with horror. To take on the darkness, to let it nestle within his soul, corrupting everything he was, he shuddered, feeling as though the very essence of the inn was clawing at him, reaching out to claim his spirit. The darkness was seductive, promising power and escape, but he knew it would leave him hollow, twisted beyond recognition. The silence grew unbearable, and Lucas realized that his time was running out. The shadows in the room began to press against him, constricting, tightening like a vice around his throat. He felt his mind fraying, unraveling under the weight of the decision. The figure's form began to shift, growing larger, more menacing, as if feeding off his fear and indecision. In a final, desperate act, Lucas made his choice. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, and whispered a silent goodbye to a piece of himself. The room fell silent, the shadows retracting, and for a brief moment, he felt a crushing emptiness, a hollow ache where something precious had once been. The figure vanished, leaving only the faintest echo of laughter, his mother's laugh, now distant and fading, like a memory slipping through his fingers. The spinning top slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor and spinning in an endless circle, as if mocking him. Lucas felt a part of his soul dim, forever lost to the inn's malevolent hunger, and as he stumbled back into the dark corridors, he knew that though he had escaped the immediate horror, he would never truly be whole again. Lucas wandered through the twisting hallways of the inn, his heart hollow from the sacrifice he had just made. The corridors seemed darker now, as if the building itself had absorbed his anguish and grown hungrier, more hostile. Shadows clung to every corner, dense and suffocating, twisting into unnatural shapes that seemed to stretch toward him like skeletal hands. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the old wood, resonated through the silent halls, amplifying the oppressive dread that settled over him like a second skin. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, each beat echoing in the silence, as if he were the only living thing within the inn's decaying walls. A faint whisper drifted through the air, soft and indistinct, like the murmur of leaves in a forgotten forest. He stopped, straining to listen, his breath hitching as he realized the sound was closer than he had first thought. It was no longer a distant murmur. It was right there, lurking in the darkness, just beyond the edges of his vision. The whisper was low, like the rustle of a long-forgotten memory, and though he couldn't make out the words, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, an instinctive warning from some deep, primal part of his mind. As he took a step forward, the whisper grew louder, transforming from a vague murmur into words, spoken in a voice that sounded eerily familiar. It was his own voice, yet tinged with a coldness, a distant echo of despair and regret. "You shouldn't have come here, Lucas," it whispered, the words dripping with malice. "You belong to us now." His blood ran cold as the whisper seemed to slither around him, filling the air with an unnatural weight. He whipped around, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness and the oppressive silence that filled the space around him. But then he saw it, a fleeting, half-seen movement in the corner of his eye. A shape, barely distinguishable from the shadows, yet unmistakably human, slinking along the wall, watching him with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. He stumbled backward, his heart racing as the figure shifted and multiplied, shadows detaching from the walls to form new shapes, each one a warped, distorted version of himself. They moved in eerie unison, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, their limbs twisting as if pulled by invisible strings. The whispering intensified, overlapping voices echoing in a cacophony of dread, each one repeating the same words in his own voice. "You left something behind. You left something behind." Lucas backed away, his hands trembling as he tried to escape the maddening whispers that surrounded him. The figures melted back into the walls, only to reappear closer, emerging from the darkness as if pulled by some unseen force. Their eyes bore into him, empty and hollow, reflecting his fear back at him. He could feel their presence, a chilling weight that pressed against his skin, suffocating him with their malice. Each step he took seemed to bring him closer to them, even as he tried to retreat, as if the inn itself was bending reality, trapping him in an endless loop of terror. A cold wind swept through the hallway, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell of decay and rot. He gagged, pressing a hand to his mouth as the whispering grew louder, now intermingling with a distant, rhythmic sound, like the beating of a heart, slow and deliberate, echoing through the walls. It was as if the inn itself were alive, its heart beating in time with his own, merging their fates in a grotesque symbiosis. He tried to ground himself, focusing on his breathing, but the whispers began to sink into his mind, prying into his thoughts with relentless persistence. They weren't just sounds, they were memories, fragments of his past, twisted and distorted, voices of people he had known, but now filled with bitterness and betrayal. He heard his own mother's voice, now cold and mocking, asking why he had abandoned her, why he had chosen to leave a part of himself behind. The accusations cut through him like icy knives, their sharpness amplified by the guilt and horror clawing at his mind. As he stumbled forward, the shadows thickened, gathering in the shape of a massive doorway he hadn't seen before. A faint glow pulsed from within, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, moving in sync with the whispers. Drawn by a force he couldn't resist, Lucas stepped toward the doorway, his feet moving as if controlled by some unseen will. The air grew colder with each step, biting into his skin and seeping into his bones, numbing him with a chill that felt like the touch of death itself. He crossed the threshold, entering a vast, dimly lit room where the shadows clung to the walls like dark, pulsing veins. In the center of the room stood a mirror, tall and imposing, its surface fogged and cracked, yet reflecting something far more sinister than his own image. Staring back at him from the depths of the glass was his own reflection, but it was twisted, warped into a grotesque mockery of himself. His eyes were hollow, filled with an unearthly light, and his mouth was twisted into a cruel smile that didn't belong to him. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices merging into a single, overwhelming chorus that echoed inside his skull, filling his mind with a terror he couldn't escape. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, mirroring his own movements, but there was something wrong, something horribly out of sync. As Lucas reached toward the mirror, his reflection's hand passed through the glass, its fingers stretching out toward him, long and claw-like, reaching to pull him into the darkness beyond. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows that now filled the room, wrapping around him like chains, binding him to the floor as the figure in the mirror stepped out, its hollow eyes fixed on him with a gaze that seemed to pierce his very soul. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the whispers faded into silence, leaving only the soft, rhythmic sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure vanished, melting back into the shadows, leaving Lucas alone in the dimly lit room, his heart pounding in his chest. But he knew that the terror was far from over. The whispers would return. The shadows would come for him again, drawn to the piece of himself he had left behind, a sacrifice to the malevolent force that lurked within the inn's walls. Lucas's steps echoed down the hallway, each footfall swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the air, then seemed to breathe around him, its walls pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if alive, as if it were feeding off his fear. With every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, Lucas felt his mind fraying, his grip on reality slipping. He was no longer sure what was real and what was a trick of the darkness, a shadow lurking just beyond his vision. The whispers had stopped, leaving an eerie silence, but the absence of sound was worse. It was a vacuum, filled with a suffocating dread that pressed down on him, stifling his every breath. As he moved deeper into the inn, Lucas began to see things that couldn't possibly be there, visions that flickered at the edge of his sight, like memories that didn't belong to him. He caught glimpses of people in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and hollow, drifting through the corridors with expressions of hopelessness etched into their features. Their eyes were empty, their skin tinged with an unnatural gray, as if they had been drained of life, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. They would appear for a fleeting second, then vanish, leaving him questioning his own sanity. A chilling sensation crept up his spine as he realized that the inn was prying into his mind, dredging up his deepest fears, twisting his memories into grotesque mockeries. He saw flashes of his childhood home, but it was warped, decaying, like the inn itself. The familiar warmth was gone, replaced by shadows that stretched unnaturally long, swallowing the comforting spaces of his past. His mother's voice echoed through the hallways, but it was distorted, laced with despair, calling his name with a desperation that chilled him to the bone. The inn was feeding off him, using his own memories, his own fears, to break him down. It knew his mind intimately, knew exactly how to dig into the cracks of his psyche and pry them open, filling the gaps with a darkness so deep it felt endless. He tried to resist, but the visions only grew stronger, each one more terrifying and personal than the last, until he could no longer tell where his memories ended and the inn's influence began. Every step he took seemed to drag him further into a nightmare of his own making, a maze of terror that was somehow tied to his soul. Suddenly, he found himself standing before an old, battered door, its wood warped and splintered. He didn't remember walking to it, didn't remember choosing this path, but he felt an inexplicable pull, as though something waited for him on the other side. The handle was cold under his touch, sending a shiver up his arm as he pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, but he could feel something waiting for him in the shadows, a presence that radiated a bone-chilling malevolence. It was as if the air itself was alive, filled with an unspoken threat that crept into his lungs, making it difficult to breathe. Stepping inside, Lucas was enveloped by an impenetrable darkness, a blackness so deep it seemed to consume all light, all hope. And then he heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of breathing coming from just beyond the edge of his vision. It was deep, ragged, filled with an unnatural hunger, and it echoed through the darkness, resonating in his bones. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear that was unlike anything he had ever known. In the silence, the breathing grew closer, a slow, relentless approach that filled him with a terror so intense it was almost unbearable. His mind flashed with images of himself, hollowed out, twisted into one of the lost souls he had seen wandering the halls. He could feel the inn's presence pressing against him, a suffocating force that wrapped around his mind, whispering promises of escape if he would only surrender, if he would only embrace the fear and let it consume him. The darkness shifted, and he saw something moving just ahead, a figure barely visible, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that glowed faintly, piercing the blackness like cold, predatory stars. It was his own face staring back at him, but twisted, altered, filled with a darkness that radiated from within. The figure reached out a hand, beckoning him, its mouth twisting into a mocking smile. "Isn't this what you wanted, Lucas?" it whispered, its voice a sickly echo of his own, laced with a malice that set his skin crawling. To know what lies beyond, to taste the forbidden, to feel the edge of fears. Lucas felt himself swaying, drawn to the figure, mesmerized by the promise in its eyes. He could sense the darkness calling to him, a temptation that promised freedom from his fear, if only he would give in, if only he would surrender to the terror and let it become a part of him. The figure extended its hand further, and he felt his own arm lifting, his fingers stretching toward its cold, empty grasp, as if compelled by an unseen force. A part of him fought back, a flicker of resistance, a tiny spark of who he was before he had entered the inn. But the darkness was overwhelming, pressing down on him, filling his mind with visions of oblivion, of a peace that could only come from letting go, from becoming one with the shadows. He could feel himself slipping, his will weakening, as the figure's hand grew closer, the air around him thickening with a suffocating dread. And then, in a sudden surge of clarity, Lucas yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the figure with a gasp. The darkness recoiled, a hiss of anger echoing through the room as the figure's form melted into the shadows, its glowing eyes fading into the blackness. The temptation lingered, a cold whisper in the back of his mind, a lingering promise that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had resisted, but he knew the darkness would never truly let him go. As he staggered out of the room, back into the desolate halls of the inn, he felt a chill settle deep within his bones, an icy reminder of the choice he had nearly made. The inn's whispers followed him, taunting him, promising that he could never escape, that the fear would live within him now, a part of him that he could never erase. The walls seemed to close in around him, their shadows pressing closer, as if hungry for the piece of himself he had almost given. Lucas knew he would carry this fear forever, that he had glimpsed something beyond human understanding, something that had marked him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The inn had shown him the depths of his own soul, had tempted him with oblivion, and though he had resisted, he knew that the darkness would be waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, a silent, eternal reminder of the fear he had faced, and the fear that would never leave him. Lucas felt himself teetering on the edge of despair as he wandered deeper into the twisted labyrinth of the inn. The walls seemed to shift around him, folding in unnatural angles, distorting his sense of direction until he felt as though he was walking in circles, hopelessly lost. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and bending, moving as if they had a life of their own. Every corner he turned seemed to lead him back to the same place, a large, empty room with a single flickering light, casting a dim, sickly glow over the rotting wallpaper and cracked floorboards. He stood in the center of the room, gripping the spinning top in his hand, its chipped paint flaking onto his palm. His mind was filled with fragments of memories that weren't entirely his own, half-formed visions that seemed to belong to someone or something else. Faces he didn't recognize flashed before him, eyes wide with terror, mouths twisted in silent screams, as if they were trapped in their own personal hell within the walls of the inn. He could feel their anguish, their desperation, their overwhelming fear, as if their spirits were pressing in on him, clamoring for release. The air grew colder, and a low hum began to vibrate through the walls, filling the room with a tension that set his nerves on edge. Then, out of the silence, a voice called his name. It was soft at first, almost gentle, but it held an undercurrent of menace that made his skin crawl. "Lucas," the voice whispered, dragging out each syllable, relishing the sound. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, reverberating through his mind, pulling him toward the shadows that clustered in the far corner of the room. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he saw something emerging from the darkness, a figure cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its eyes glowing with an unnatural, eerie light. The figure seemed to radiate a darkness that seeped into the room, turning the air thick and heavy, as if the shadows themselves had weight. It stood there, motionless, watching him with a gaze that pierced through his soul, dredging up every hidden fear, every suppressed doubt, until he felt completely exposed. Lucas could barely breathe, his chest tight with a terror that left him paralyzed. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and with each step, the room grew colder, the shadows deepening, pressing against him like a physical force. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet were rooted to the floor, his body frozen in place by the sheer weight of the figure's presence. It felt as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss that held nothing but endless darkness and despair. The figure extended a hand toward him, its fingers long and bony, reaching out with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. Lucas felt a shiver run through him as the hand stopped just inches from his chest, and he could feel the cold radiating from it, an unnatural chill that seeped into his skin. "You've come this far," the figure whispered, its voice filling his mind, drowning out his own thoughts. "You've seen what lies beneath. Now, do you dare to look further?" A choice lay before him, a decision he could feel in his bones, as if the very essence of the inn was demanding an answer from him. He could feel the weight of that choice pressing down on him, the understanding that whatever he decided in this moment would change him forever. If he accepted the figure's invitation, if he chose to face whatever horror lay beyond this threshold, he knew it would mean surrendering a piece of himself, perhaps even his soul, to the inn's insatiable darkness. But there was a flicker of defiance within him, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He thought of a life he had outside of this place, the world he would return to, and he clung to that thought, grounding himself in the face of the overwhelming dread. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he raised his head, meeting the figure's gaze, refusing to look away. "I won't give in," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with a quiet determination. The figure's expression shifted, a hint of amusement crossing its shadowed face. It was as if the inn had been waiting for this moment, for someone to confront it, to resist its pull. The figure's hand moved closer, its fingers brushing against Lucas's chest, and he felt an intense, freezing pain radiate through his body, as if the very life were being drained from him. The shadows around him thickened, closing in, pressing against him until he could barely see, barely breathe. And then, the inn itself seemed to shift, its walls vibrating with a low, rumbling sound, like a deep, guttural growl. The floor beneath his feet trembled, and cracks began to spread through the walls, oozing darkness, a black, viscous substance that dripped and pooled, forming twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and squirm, reaching out to him like tendrils of shadow. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from his own, and in the dim light, Lucas could see his own reflection staring back at him from within its eyes. It was him, yet it wasn't. It was a version of himself that had succumbed to the darkness, eyes hollow, face gaunt, twisted with fear and despair. The reflection mouthed a single word, a silent plea that echoed in his mind. Help. In that moment, Lucas realized that he wasn't just facing a ghost or a demon. He was confronting a fragment of himself, a piece of his own soul that the inn had claimed, twisted into something unrecognizable. He understood that the inn fed on fear, on weakness, on the parts of people they tried to hide. And he knew that if he gave in, if he let this moment of terror break him, he would be lost to the inn forever, just another ghost wandering its halls. With a final surge of strength, he took a step back, breaking the connection, pulling himself away from the figure's grasp. The shadows recoiled, hissing in frustration, retreating into the walls as the figure melted back into the darkness, its eyes fading until there was nothing left but the silence. The room grew still, the oppressive weight lifting, and Lucas felt a rush of relief, a warmth spreading through his body as he realized he had won. He had faced the inn's darkest secret and emerged intact. But as he turned to leave, he caught one last glimpse in the cracked mirror by the door. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His eyes held a shadow, a flicker of darkness that hadn't been there before, a reminder that the inn had left its mark on him. He knew deep down that he would carry this darkness with him forever, a scar on his soul, a piece of himself that would always be bound to the inn, a silent, eternal reminder of the terror he had faced and the price he had paid to survive. The inn was silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for Lucas's next move. The air was thick, oppressive, clinging to him like a cold, wet shroud as he stood at the threshold of the final room. He had reached the heart of the inn, a place that pulsed with a dark energy, an aura of malevolence that seeped from every crack in the walls, every whisper in the shadows. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the empty space, each step sending a shiver of dread through him, a reminder that he was nearing the end of this twisted journey. He could feel the weight of his fear pressing down on him, but something deeper, a fierce determination, kept him moving forward. In the center of the room stood a large, ancient mirror, its surface darkened and cracked, as if it had absorbed centuries of suffering. The air around it vibrated with an unnatural hum, and Lucas could sense that something was waiting on the other side, something that had been watching him, waiting for him, feeding on his fear. He knew, with a cold certainty, that this mirror was more than just an object. It was a portal, a doorway into the very essence of the inn, a place where reality twisted and bent to the will of the darkness lurking within. He took a hesitant step closer, his breath hitching as the surface of the mirror began to ripple, distorting his reflection into something monstrous. His own face stared back at him, but the eyes were hollow, empty, filled with an otherworldly darkness that seemed to reach out, clawing into his mind. The figure in the mirror smiled, a twisted, mocking grin that sent a chill down his spine. It was a version of himself that had succumbed to the inn's influence, a reflection of what he could become if he gave in to the fear, if he let the darkness consume him. The figure in the mirror leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass, and Lucas felt an invisible force pulling him closer, drawing him toward his own reflection. He fought to resist, but his feet seemed to move on their own, inching toward the mirror, as if compelled by an unseen power. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became, until he was standing just inches from the glass, staring into the eyes of his doppelganger. The reflection's mouth moved, whispering words that only he could hear, a taunting voice that echoed through his mind. "You think you're strong enough to escape?" It sneered, the words dripping with contempt. "You're nothing but a shadow, a flicker of light in the darkness. You belong to the inn now. You'll never be free." The words cut into him like a knife, a painful reminder of the despair that had nearly overwhelmed him. But Lucas clenched his fists, feeling a surge of defiance rise within him. He had come too far, faced too many horrors, to let himself be defeated now. He refused to let the inn take him, refused to let this twisted version of himself win. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and placed his hand on the mirror, his fingers pressing against the cold, unyielding glass. The moment his skin touched the surface, the room erupted into chaos. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards of glass flying outward, cutting through the air like knives. But instead of falling to the floor, the shards hung in midair, suspended around him, each fragment reflecting a different scene, a twisted nightmare, a glimpse into a world filled with horrors beyond his imagination. He saw faces he didn't recognize, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. He saw endless corridors filled with shadows, rooms drenched in blood, visions of torment and despair that burned into his mind. Then, through the shards, he saw the entity, the heart of the inn, the malevolent force that had been watching him all along. It was a shape shrouded in darkness, its form shifting and writhing as if made of living shadows. Its eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light, piercing through the darkness, locking onto him with a gaze that froze his blood. He could feel its hatred, its hunger, radiating from it like a tangible force, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The entity reached out, its shadowy form extending toward him, and Lucas knew he was facing the true source of the inn's power. This was the force that had claimed so many souls, that had twisted the lives of everyone who dared to enter. He could feel it probing his mind, searching for any weakness, any hint of fear that it could use against him. Images of his darkest memories flashed before him, his lost childhood, moments of loneliness and despair, every insecurity and doubt he had ever felt. But Lucas fought back, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He focused on the memories that grounded him, moments of light and love, the people who mattered to him, the life he wanted to return to. He forced himself to remember that he was more than his fears, more than his darkest moments. He was stronger than this place, stronger than the shadows that sought to claim him. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, weakening as it felt his defiance. But it wasn't finished. With a furious scream, it lunged forward, engulfing him in a wave of darkness. The shadows wrapped around him, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with a cold, suffocating weight. He could feel it seeping into him, trying to take control, to pull him into the depths of the inn's endless nightmare. For a moment, he felt himself slipping, felt his mind beginning to fade, his thoughts blurring as the darkness closed in. But then, from deep within, he found a final, desperate spark of resistance. With a roar, he pushed back, forcing the darkness out, banishing it with the sheer force of his will. The entity screamed, its form unraveling, dissipating into the air as Lucas drove it back, refusing to let it take him. The room began to shake, the walls cracking, the ceiling crumbling, as the inn itself seemed to react to the entity's defeat. The shadows receded, the oppressive weight lifting as the inn's power began to fade. Lucas stumbled back, gasping for breath, feeling a rush of relief as the darkness finally released its hold on him. He was free. As he turned to leave, he caught one last glimpse in a piece of shattered glass lying on the floor. His reflection stared back at him, and for a moment, he thought he saw the shadow of the entity lurking in his eyes, a faint reminder of the darkness he had faced. But he pushed the thought aside, determined to leave this nightmare behind. He stepped out of the room, making his way back through the decaying halls, the walls crumbling around him as the inn collapsed, its power broken. As he crossed the threshold, leaving the inn behind, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders, the oppressive presence finally fading. The morning light broke through the mist, casting a warm glow over the swamp as he took his first steps toward freedom. As he reached the edge of the swamp, he dared to glance back, half expecting to see the inn still standing, defying logic and reason. But all that remained was a vacant plot of land, overgrown with brambles and vines, as if the building had never been there at all. The ground where it once stood was a tangle of dark mud, disturbed only by his footprints. The inn had vanished into thin air, taking its secrets with it, leaving behind no trace of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. But as he turned to continue on his way, a soft, almost inaudible whisper brushed against his ear. It was a sound that sent a shiver down his spine, a voice so faint he could barely make out the words. "You may have left, but you are never truly free," it whispered, and he froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the empty swamp around him. The landscape was silent, undisturbed, yet the whisper lingered, hanging in the air like a breath of wind that refused to fade. Shaking off the feeling, he tried to convince himself it was only his imagination, a trick played by a mind still reeling from terror. But as he walked, he became increasingly aware of something unusual, a shadow at the edge of his vision, a fleeting darkness that seemed to follow him, flickering in and out of sight. He stopped glancing around, but each time he looked directly, the shadow disappeared, melting back into the mist as if it had never been there. Yet he could feel it, lurking just out of reach, a presence he couldn't shake. Days passed, and Lucas returned to his life, hoping the horrors of the inn would fade like a bad dream. But the shadow remained, always there in the corner of his eye, a silent reminder of the darkness he had faced. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, haunted by dreams of endless corridors and twisted reflections, his own face staring back at him with hollow, empty eyes. In the darkness of his room, he sometimes heard the faint sound of whispers, drifting through the silence like echoes from a place beyond reality. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he noticed something strange about his reflection in the mirror across the room. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a flicker of a shadow cast by the street lamp outside. But as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. His reflection was watching him with a subtle, unsettling intensity, its eyes darker than they should have been, the pupils unnaturally wide, as if they absorbed every hint of light. He blinked, hoping it would disappear, but the reflection remained unchanged. His own face seemed to shift, just slightly, a cruel smile curving at the corners of his mouth, yet his real mouth remained still. Heart pounding, he reached for the light switch, flooding the room with brightness, but even then, the reflection lingered, its gaze unwavering, its expression twisted in a way that was both familiar and entirely foreign. A sense of dread settled over him, a realization that he could no longer ignore. He hadn't truly escaped. A part of the inn had followed him, a piece of its darkness woven into the fabric of his own soul. The shadows in his eyes, the whispers that haunted his nights, were not just memories. They were fragments of the inn's malevolence, clinging to him like a parasite, feeding off his fear, waiting for the moment when it could take control. In the following weeks, the visions grew stronger, the shadows more persistent. Lucas began to see them everywhere, In the corners of rooms, in the reflection of glass windows, even in the eyes of strangers who glanced his way. The world around him seemed darker, the colors dimmer, as if the inn's darkness was bleeding into his reality, corrupting everything it touched. Desperate for answers, he returned to the swamp one last time, hoping to find some trace of the inn, some sign that could explain what was happening to him. But when he arrived, there was nothing but silence, an empty stretch of land covered in mist. Yet as he stood there, he felt a familiar presence, a cold hand reaching into his chest, twisting around his heart. The shadow was still with him, its roots buried deep within him, bound to him by the choices he had made, the fears he had embraced. In the silence, he heard a faint, mocking laughter echoing from somewhere deep within his own mind. It was the voice from the inn, the figure he had faced, a twisted version of himself that now lurked in his soul. "You're part of the story now, Lucas," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. "The inn may be gone, but I am with you. I am you, and one day you will return." As he walked away from the swamp, Lucas knew that he would never truly escape. The inn was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went, a darkness he could never outrun. Every reflection, every shadow, every whisper in the dark was a reminder that he belonged to something far older, something that could never be destroyed. It was a curse he would carry to his grave, a secret he would take with him into the depths of his own nightmares. And though he left the swamp that day, Lucas knew that someday, somehow, he would find himself back there, drawn by a force he could never fully understand, an inevitability that would bring him face to face with the darkness once more. The inn was gone, but its presence lingered, a mystery that could never be solved, a terror that would haunt him until the end of his days. And as the last rays of daylight faded, he saw a shadow flicker at the edge of his vision, and he knew that the inn was waiting, patient, eternal, ready for him to return.